The Minoan civilization of Crete brought us the first highly developed society in Europe. Known for the impressive architecture, art, and wealth, the Minoans established themselves as the masters of the sea trade, which helped them achieve prosperity almost unparalleled for the Bronze Age. In this episode, we will go through the early beginnings of the Minoans and talk about their gradual rise during the time of Pre-Palatial Crete. Different dates have been proposed for the first human habitation of the island of Crete. The archaeological evidence reveals stone tools likely dating to the pre-Homo sapiens habitation, at least 130,000 years old. However, the definite emergence of a Neolithic culture can be dated to around 7000 BCE, with the first farming communities developing across the island. These communities typically consisted of open villages, such as those developed on the sites of Knossos, Trapeza, Gerani, and others. Numerous fishermen huts were found along the Cretan coast, while the fertile plain of Messara was used for agriculture. These Neolithic farmers shared a lot of similarities with their counterparts of the Cycladic Islands, who had considerable influence on the development of the early Minoan communities. During the second half of the 4th millennium BCE, the Cretans started introducing their own pottery, which the archaeologists mark as the beginning of the early Minoan or Pre-Palatial period on the island of Crete. The early Minoans developed a social system usual for the late Neolithic Aegean, with the population strictly distinguished between the free men and slaves. The area of Knossos likely consisted of several villages, which were by this time merged into a town with a small group of chieftains on top of the social pyramid. By 3000 BCE, similar towns were developed out of the local communities in Phaistos, Pyrgos, and Lebena. It is unknown whether these towns were founded as dependencies of Knossos, or rather grew to prominence on their own, but it does appear that Knossos held a special sway over the other Cretan towns since the very early period. The local chieftains were eventually able to accumulate significant wealth, which was done with the control of local and regional trade that was conducted throughout the Aegean Sea. With wealth comes the power, which enabled these chieftains to go on and from the fishing and farming community leaders grow into a powerful aristocracy in control of the political and religious life of Knossos and other cities. The simple single or two-room houses were now enlarged for the aristocracy and their families, located towards the center of the city, which in the case of Knossos was numbering several thousand people. The initial storage houses, which were at the center of economic and likely political life of the early period, now grew into larger facilities. Underneath the later palace of Knossos, the archaeologists discovered traces of what they called the Great House, a two-story building where the collected goods were stored. This shows the early traces of what would later become a well-known palace economy system, where the produced goods were collected and stored inside the palatial storages in order to be later redistributed according to the needs of the society. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, several other important centers emerged on the island, such as Gurnia on the eastern part of Crete. The town was constructed using the same style, with as little as 60 and as many as several hundred houses built around the larger central facility. Also nearby was a cemetery and a road system connecting all of these features. Gurnia likely controlled or at least held sway over the eastern part of the island, with an important connection southwards. Phaistos dominated the southern part of the island, overseeing the smaller communities in the region and extending from the coastal area all the way to the Messara plain. Even in the Pre-Palatial period, Phaistos seemed to be the second most important city behind Knossos, with a significant population and resources. The far western part of the island was likely less populated due to the range of the so-called White Mountains that dominated much of the area. The main community to the west developed around the town of Kydonia, which, although not as important economically, seemed to have had kind of a more distinct identity of its own. Later Greek poets such as Homer and writers such as Strabo noted the existence of a tribe called the Kydones of the western Crete, in addition to the Eteocretans, a name which they used for what we today call the Minoans. Strabo added that according to his sources, both Eteocretans and Kydones were indigenous to the island of Crete, which was at the time of Homer's Odyssey also populated with Pelasgians, Achaeans, and Dorians. Nevertheless, the Kydones seemed to be related to the rest of the early Cretans, and any difference is difficult to tell, as Kydonia was established and grew through the same process typical for a Minoan center. As these early Minoan centers were now firmly established, the rising commerce greatly contributed to the growth in wealth and also population, enabling the towns such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Gurnia to become more urbanized and get the first features of a real city. Therefore, most of the 3rd millennium BCE marked the period of gradual rise of the Minoan culture on Crete and its gradual transformation to what we today consider a civilization. Trade, being the primary source of wealth for the Minoan centers, was at this period still mainly conducted with the nearby centers of the Cycladic culture, islands such as Naxos, Syros, Keros, and others. However, unlike the Cycladic centers, which were really tiny islands with limited population and resources behind them, the rising Cretans had more than enough both manpower and resources to soon assess themselves as the main civilization of the Aegean and absorb the surrounding cultures into their own. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the Minoan Crete saw the establishment of its first full-fledged palace centers, with the first real palaces constructed at Knossos, Phaistos, Gurnia, and other cities. This marked the beginning of the Old Palace period of Crete and the beginning of the very first civilization of Europe. Please consider subscribing and sharing the video, as this is a one-person production and it greatly helps the visibility of the channel. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, Panayotis Yiannopoulos, Fred Leckie, and Estate Care for their continuous support. If you wish to become a Patreon member, please click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we'll see you again soon.